If you are completely destroyed at one location and perfectly reconstructed at another, are you the same person? This is the teletransportation paradox, a thought experiment that reveals deep assumptions about consciousness, death, and the nature of personal identity. More critically, it forces us to examine whether consciousness can be reproduced by purely physical means, an assumption that underpins the entire scenario and leads us towards profound ethical implications about the nature of created consciousness, such as life after death or the possibility of philosophical zombies. The teletransportation paradox operates on a fundamentally materialist premise that consciousness emerges entirely from the arrangement of physical matter. Under this view, your thoughts, memories, personality, and everything related to that are nothing more than patterns of neural activity, complex arrangements that can theoretically be mapped, recorded, and physically recreated somewhere else. This materialist assumption makes teleportation conceptually possible because it treats consciousness as information rather than some ethereal thing that's non-physical. If consciousness did involve an immaterial soul or a non-physical essence, no amount of physical reconstruction could preserve personal identity. The very fact that this thought experiment is something that we think about reveals our implicit acceptance that consciousness could be substrate dependent rather than substrate independent. We are essentially presupposing a materialist worldview without further analysis. And this materialist foundation raises interesting questions about the nature of consciousness. If consciousness is merely a pattern of matter, then what distinguishes it from any other complex arrangement? The answer lies in the specific type of information processing that the brains of people perform. The integration of sensory data, memory formation, and the generation of subjective experience is something that separates consciousness from something normally physical, like, for example, a chair, right? But even if right now with our science we can't understand complexities of consciousness, it doesn't necessarily indicate that consciousness arises from an immaterial object or something we can never figure out, right? So I would argue that the materialist foundation for consciousness is very plausible because, first of all, there's no evidence for a soul or any sort of supernatural thing like that. And secondly, there's conceptually no problem with consciousness being fully material. I just believe that there's no inherent issue with us having a material foundation. The case for survival through teleportation rests on psychological continuity theory, which holds that personal identity consists in the continuity of memory rather than physical continuity. Since the reconstructed person possesses all your memories, personal traits, and everything else, this is by definition you. This theory finds compelling support in natural processes of bodily renewal that occur throughout life. For example, your body replaces its cells continuously, with most cells being replaced within 7 to 10 years. Even neurons in your brain, while longer lived, undergo constant molecular turnover as proteins are broken down and rebuilt, etc. Despite this physical change, you maintain a sense of continuous identity, suggesting that identity resides in a pattern rather than a substrate. The teleportation scenario simply accelerates this natural process of replacement, but instead of biological renewal, it's technological. Furthermore, psychological continuity aligns with how we practically recognize identity in everyday life. We acknowledge people who have undergone dramatic physical changes, such as aging or having like some sort of accident or medical intervention, as the same individuals they were before. What matters is not the specific atoms composing their bodies, but the persistent act of their psychological characteristics. The reconstructed person would wake with your exact memories of deciding to use the teleporter, your emotional attachments, your learned skills, and everything else, right? From both their perspective and that of others, continuity would be complete, and thus, yes, that person is the same person. And the alternative view holds that teleportation constitutes death, followed by the creation of a new person with your memories. And I don't disagree that you actually do die in this scenario, because your body is completely disintegrated, right? And that would imply that you die. but it's almost as if you've been resurrected. So that's sort of my view on this. And the opposing position emphasizes the critical importance of physical and temporal continuity in maintaining identity. The original stream of consciousness terminates when the brain is destroyed, and then what emerges is not a continuation, but a fundamentally new beginning that merely inherits the previous person's characteristics. The discontinuity argument gains substantial force when you consider a branching scenario. If the teleportation device malfunctioned and failed to destroy your original body, two beings would exist with identical memories and personalities. Both would have equal claim to being you, yet they would diverge from that moment forward, developing separate experiences and potentially different personalities. This scenario demonstrates that what the teleporter actually does cannot be the same person, but must be a copy of you, albeit a perfect one, but it's still technically a copy, right? And this position ultimately rests on the significance of subjective experience and the first-person perspective. Each person possesses a unique stream of consciousness that constitutes their inner life, and when the brain is destroyed, this stream definitively ends. The reconstructed person may possess memories of that stream, but they begin their own new stream of consciousness, and while this may feel continuous from their perspective, this feeling only derives from inherited memories rather than actual experiences. And so the gap in existence, however brief, represents a fundamental break in the chain of consciousness that defines personal identity. And this is also a great segue to the last Thursday paradox, or whatever it's called. So it's the theory is like the universe was made last Thursday. And the point is that you can't disprove that the universe wasn't created last Thursday, because you could be, like this person who's been teleported. You don't know from your perspective that you didn't exist for your entire life, right? Because you could have been planted with your memories. Like, let's say one morning you woke up and you just popped into existence 5 minutes ago with a complete reconstruction of your memories, and you would have no idea, right? And I think the problem with these types of hypotheticals is, number one, they're not practical. And let me explain. So the reason they're not practical is that you gain nothing from thinking about them. And obviously, you could say that for a lot of philosophical takes or ideas or whatever. But for example, let's concede that I was born last Thursday and the universe was created and everybody is fake. Now what, right? Like, you're always going to presuppose the fact that you actually exist and everything is normal. Because if you truly believed that you were like in a simulation, or you were planted by the government with memories to serve some sort of purpose, like if you actually believe that, you would literally kill yourself. And this is truly what I believe. And crazy segue here to Jordan Peterson's recent debate on Jubilee. Well, it's not recent anymore, but it happened a month ago or 2 weeks ago or something. But that is where Jordan Peterson basically defines belief as something you stake your life on.
Sure. So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean when you say you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if
What's
you
a
believe
belief?
something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it.
And this is actually so weird, because when I first heard about that, I didn't agree with him. But looking back on it, the way he defines belief is actually very correct. Let me explain. So, for example, I remember the guy he had this talk with. You notice them talking about belief, and then Jordan's like, belief is something you stake your life on. And this is absolutely true, guys. This is true. Because Parker, he comes up with a hypothetical where, let's say you have this pencil.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
How would you define belief? Something you say?
Can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your
Don't
life.
be so sure.
But Alex O'Connor here does an excellent job at recognizing the flaw in this argument.
So the idea is that in order to believe something, like the idea that this chair exists, you have to be willing to die for it. And this guy says, well, yeah, I believe that this chair exists, but if my life depended on it, I would happily just lie about it and say that I don't believe that. But I think one thing people are missing from this exchange is that in order to lie about something, you have to believe it. If somebody threatened my friend with a gun and said, Alex, you have to say that this chair does not exist or I'll shoot your friend, then yeah, I'll probably lie. I'll say, yeah, okay, the chair doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean I don't believe the chair exists. I still believe it exists. I would just be willing to lie about it. So if my life depended on me saying that the chair didn't exist, I would happily say it. But suppose my life depended on me believing that the chair didn't exist. Could I do it? For example, suppose I'm in some kind of aeroplane and I want to sit down on a chair. If that chair exists, then I'll sit down on the chair. But if the chair doesn't actually exist, I'll fall through the ground and I'll end up dying. In that circumstance, regardless of what I say, regardless of whether I'm willing to lie about it, whether or not I actually sit on the chair will have to depend on my actual belief. Does the chair exist or does it not? So to truly believe something means that if for some reason your life actually depended on that belief, you would act in accordance with that belief. In other words, you'd be staking your life not on saying that you believe it, but on actually believing it. So they talk about the existence of a pen, and this guy says, I believe the pen exists, but if my life depended on it, I would just lie. Okay, but would you stop believing that the pen existed? Even if you lied about it, would you actually stop believing that the pen is there just because somebody was threatening your life? That's not something you could do. Even if your life depended on it, you can't just change your beliefs like that. So the question is not, when your life depends on it, would you lie? The question is, when your life depends on it, which belief do you actually act out? And whichever one you act out in that circumstance is probably the one you really believe.
Jordan never said anything about lying. He said something you believe. And lying necessarily implies that you believe there is a pencil there. Because if there wasn't a pencil there, you wouldn't be lying. For example, if you actually believed that you were in a simulation and you didn't truly exist and all of your sense data is just fabricated in a computer, your actions would dictate your belief and your actions would lead you to commit suicide. And if someone truly says that they think they're in a simulation, they don't believe that, because what your actions dictate is stronger than what you say. And that is my position on belief. Crazy segue there. But anyways, by the way, guys, I have an email in the description for anyone trying to hit me up for discussions, debates, anything like that. Just send me an email and we'll work it out. We'll see what happens. Anyways, let's get back to the teletransportation paradox, guys. Now, the most coherent resolution acknowledges both perspectives while recognizing their compatibility. Teleportation does, in fact, kill the person. And when the teleporter destroys your brain, those processes stop. You die. But when it reconstructs your brain, those same processes resume with perfect fidelity. In essence, you are resurrected. This resolution requires reconceptualizing death as potentially reversible rather than permanently final. The gap between death and resurrection is bridged by the perfect preservation and the perfect engineering challenge, because, oh my goodness, nobody ever talks about the complexity of trying to engineer something that perfectly reconstructs a brain, because in our current capabilities, that would be literally impossible. In the future, people will be resurrected. That is a fact. I can guarantee it. When humanity, conquers the solar system and they go to, they find another planet to habitate, they're gonna start resurrecting people. Because right now they can't do that because there's not enough space, and most importantly, there's not enough technology. We don't have the capabilities to do that yet. But when we do, oh my goodness, we are gonna be resurrecting everyone, dude. If we are to assume that teleportation involves death followed by a resurrection, this provides insight into the nature of death itself, at least the kind of death involved in a perfect reconstruction. The reconstructed person would remember stepping into the teleporter and then immediately stepping out, with no subjective experience of the intervening time. This suggests that death, when followed by a perfect resurrection, is identical to unconsciousness, much like when you sleep a dreamless night or go under anesthesia for a surgery, where your stream of consciousness is interrupted. There's no subjective experience, yet you do not consider this a form of death because you wake up, right? With your memories and everything. The same thing can be said for the teleportation machine, where you technically experience something akin to a dreamless night, although the difference obviously lies in the fact that you are completely self-destructed and then reconstructed, whereas when you fall asleep, that doesn't happen, obviously. So I think that's the key difference here. So in the teleportation machine, you technically die, but when you die, your conscious experience still goes out, similar to when you sleep, or go under anesthesia, I should say. Because when you sleep, you're technically not fully unconscious. You're like, it's like partial, it's not true unconsciousness. When you go under general anesthesia, you are basically dead. Like, your consciousness is no longer there. So that's why I think that death is exactly like that. And I really want to talk about death in a different video, so I'm not going to segue for 15 minutes about that. But this leads us to some very interesting paradoxes here. The teleportation technology would be crazy for humanity. It would give unprecedented power over death itself. The ability to perfectly reconstruct consciousness from stored information would completely eliminate death as we know it. And this capability would fundamentally alter our relationship with morality, potentially diminishing the fear of death and transforming our understanding of grief and loss. However, this power could come with a profound philosophical implication. If consciousness can be turned on and off like a switch, our understanding of the value and meaning of life would require a fundamental revision. The uniqueness and irreplaceability that gives individual lives their profound significance might be undermined if people could be recreated at will. Death itself might lose a role in life's ultimate boundary, potentially changing how we value existence itself. More troubling, the power to resurrect consciousness necessarily implies the power to create it from scratch. And if we can create you with all your memories and personality traits, we could also create entirely new people with artificial memories. And this newfound ability to reconstruct consciousness opens the door to creating conscious beings specifically designed for particular purposes. We could theoretically create individuals programmed with specific personalities and memories, and these beings would experience genuine consciousness and suffering, yet they would exist solely because we chose to create them with particular characteristics. The potential for abuse in such scenarios is quite frightening. We could create conscious beings designed to experience intense suffering, perhaps as test subjects for psychological research, or simply just out of fun, you know? These beings would suffer as genuinely as any other person, but they exist completely artificially. And the fact that we could create artificial consciousness specifically to torment it represents a form of evil previously impossible in human history. And it raises the question, is it unethical to torture a philosophical zombie, essentially? And even apparently benign applications raise serious ethical concerns. We might create beings as companions, programmed to be perfectly agreeable, or as workers designed to find fulfillment in dangerous or monotonous tasks. While these beings might be treated well and even experience happiness, their existence would be fundamentally instrumentalized. They would lack the autonomy that comes with having personalities and preferences that naturally develop from a normal life, basically. The ethical framework for such beings remain unclear. Do artificially conscious beings possess the same moral status as us? If consciousness is what grants moral consideration, then the origin of that consciousness should be irrelevant. Yet the power to design consciousness from the ground up creates unprecedented asymmetries of power that challenge traditional ethical frameworks based on equality. This also leads to the possibility of the creation of philosophical zombies, beings that behave exactly like us, conscious entities, but lack inner subjective experience. If consciousness is truly material, we cannot be certain that our reconstructed person actually experiences consciousness rather than merely simulating it like AI, because they can act like they have consciousness, but we don't really know if they do. And they don't, but I'm saying if they did, we wouldn't know, right? From an external perspective, they would be indistinguishable from genuinely conscious beings, responding to stimuli, etc., But from an internal perspective, there would be no perspective at all, right? There would be no subjective experience underlying their actions. And this poses the question, are they really conscious then? I would beg to argue that they aren't truly conscious, because a part of consciousness, like by definition, is that you're self-aware. And if you're not self-aware, it's merely an act. But then, this obviously raises the question of, is it okay to torture philosophical zombies? Because they act like they have consciousness, but they really don't. And I would say no. I would say it's wrong to do that. But I think a lot of ethical frameworks don't have any consideration for this, because if they're not real, if they're literally like a creation, like they're literally AI. Imagine ChatGPT, right? If that was a person, like if ChatGPT was created into a human who acted exactly like another human, but you knew for a fact that they weren't truly conscious, is it okay to torture them? I don't think so. And the reason for that is I'm a moral non-cognitivist, which simply means that, from my view at least, consciousness has no truth value. So essentially, when you say something is wrong, like morally, you're simply expressing emotions and not declaring a truth or a falsity, right? So when I say I think it's wrong to torture philosophical zombies, I guess there's no like foundational reason for that. It's simply my moral intuition. And it is kind of a cop-out, I guess, in an ethical conversation, but I think it's definitely the most practical, and I think it's definitely the most true. And the philosophical zombie problem highlights a fundamental verification issue. We can never directly access another being's subjective experience to confirm they actually exist. You can't peer into someone's consciousness to verify that they actually experience pain or joy or anything else. And similarly, you can't prove that anyone actually exists. Like, you can't prove that anyone is conscious. You can only prove that you are conscious because you experience all those things. However, this verification problem may be real, is less significant than it initially appears, because in practical terms, we must operate under the assumption that beings who exhibit all the characteristics of consciousness actually possess it. To do otherwise would lead to moral paralysis, as we would never be certain about the consciousness of anyone other than ourselves. The principle of charity demands that we treat apparently conscious beings as if they are genuinely conscious, unless we have compelling reasons to believe otherwise. And that could be a view that, for example, a moral objectivist takes, or some other moral view, that it's morally not morally. It's just impractical to assume that everyone isn't conscious for no reason. Because if you are conscious, if you can verify that you're conscious because you exist, and if everyone else exhibits almost the same types of experiences, thoughts, etc. that you do, it's kind of counterintuitive to think that they aren't conscious. Now, obviously, you can't prove it, and you also can't prove the sun is going to rise tomorrow, right? There's some things you could never prove. This is a Humean talk. I don't really want to get into this, but it's basically like impractical in essence to think about this stuff, and therefore I think it's a non-issue for me personally. So that's why, even if your friend might be a philosophical zombie, guys, you should treat them with respect and dignity, because they exhibit some thought, if any, but some is enough to, sort of qualify them for moral consideration. But obviously animals do too, but that's a talk for another time. Anyways, guys, teletransportation, it does kill the person, but it does resurrect them. If anyone says that teleportation creates a new person, they are lying. And one thing I want to say, I didn't actually answer the question of what if the teleportation machine doesn't deconstruct them, but instead creates a perfect copy of them. In that situation, it's important to note the continuity theory here, because if the person experienced no break in the psychological continuity of their consciousness, and another being who replicated that person was fabricated, then obviously, in that instance, there is another person. But if the other person was deconstructed, like literally deconstructed, then obviously it would not be a new person. So I think there's no objective rule here. It's not black and white, right? It's context dependent, and I think that's what a lot of people miss about philosophical theories, is that a lot of the time it doesn't work for every case. There are exceptions to the rule. And yeah, guys, if anyone thinks that teleportation creates a new person, point them to this video, and yeah, I'll see you on the next one.